So greetings and welcome everyone to New Directions in Field Recording, Pluralising the Field. And thank you very much for joining us for this event this evening, which is organised by the MeCCSA Sound Studies Network. My name's Andy Birtwistle and I'm currently the chair of the network, and I'll be chairing tonight's session. Before I introduce our speakers, there are a couple of organisational and housekeeping things to say about tonight's event. We would ask everyone to switch off their microphones during the presentations, and just to let you know that this session is being recorded. So if you prefer not to be recorded, please ensure that your microphone and your camera are turned off. Our thanks to MeCCSA, the Media, Communication and Cultural Studies Association, for supporting the network and tonight's event, and of course to our two speakers this evening, who are Isobel Anderson and Tullis Rennie. When we were planning this event, Tullis and Isobel expressed a desire to make this evening's session a bit more conversational than the traditional seminar. And so there'll be plenty of opportunity to share your thoughts, ideas, knowledge and experience in the second part of the session, as well as to ask questions relating to the presentation by Isobel and Tullis. If you'd like to contribute to the conversation in the second part of the session, we'd ask you to raise your virtual hand and then I'll invite you to turn on your microphone and to begin the conversation. Now, the idea for this event began with a conversation between Tullis, Isobel and myself about their own work on self-reflexive narrative in field recording, which they've explored both through creative practice and also in their co-authored journal article, Thoughts in the Field, which was published in Organised Sound in 2016. This move to addressing the presence of the recordist within the recording, it seems to me at least, has important ethical and political ramifications. But surprisingly, it's a topic that's received little attention within sound studies. At the same time, self-reflexive practice is but one of the many ways in which field recording has developed and continues to develop in response to political and ethical concerns. And so, using their own work as a departure point, in tonight's session, Isobel and Tullis are going to discuss how issues around access, democratisation, diversity and inclusion are being explored in and through field recording as creative practice. And our hope is that as a network event, the conversational part of tonight's session will provide a forum in which people can share and exchange knowledge, experience and ideas. And the hope is that the recording of tonight's event will be a resource for us, the sound studies community, and through which we can learn from one another. And so now to our speakers. So Isobel Anderson has been making, performing and producing music for over 20 years. She has a PhD in Sonic Arts from the Sonic Arts Research Centre at Queen's University Belfast, and has a passion for creating supportive music tech education spaces for women. Her 4 solo albums have amassed over 25 million Spotify streams, and her sound works have been performed internationally. She's published articles in journals such as Organised Sound and the Journal of Sonic Studies, and threaded throughout her work is a fascination with how we make sense of ourselves, the world around us, and the process of creative exploration itself. And Isobel is proud to produce and host the critically acclaimed feminist music tech podcast, Girls Twiddling Knobs. Tullis Rennie is a composer, improvising trombonist, electronic musician and field recordist. He completed a PhD in composition at the Sonic Arts Research Centre, Queen's University in Belfast, and his work has been presented at concerts and festivals worldwide, as well as being broadcast in the UK on BBC Radio 3 and Resonance FM. He's co-founder of Walls on Walls with visual artist Laurie Nuchka, and a member of Insectotropics, audiovisual collective based in Barcelona. He curates the multimodal label with Claudia Molitor, and his writing has been published in Organised Sound and Leonardo Music Journal. He features on releases by the Luminous label, Zero Wave, and FP Records, and he's currently Senior Lecturer in Music at City University of London. Before I hand over to our two presenters this evening, I'll just let you know we're going to be sharing some audio files with you through the chat. So we did a little test before the event, and we felt that playing some of the audio files over Teams, over the internet, didn't do justice to that work. So what's going to happen is at certain points in the talk, in the initial part of the session, Isobel and Tullis will direct you towards the chat and give you a few minutes to listen to specific pieces or to look at a link on a video, on YouTube. Okay, so I'll shut up for now and hand over to Tullis and Isobel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy. And hello, everybody.
Hi, everybody. Many thanks, Andy. Lovely to see you all.
Yeah, so Tullis, we actually had some notes to introduce each other, but I feel like Andy did such a good job. There's not a lot of new stuff that we can give people apart from our personal tidbits, which is that Tullis is a lifelong biscuit aficionado, enjoys baking bread, dancing in small loud clubs, and a good Negroni.
That's right. Yeah, the only thing I would add aside from your tidbits is that I really, really recommend the podcast. If you haven't ever downloaded or tuned into Girls Twiddling Knobs, I think it's fantastic. And it's also worth saying that it's recently been shortlisted for a Lovie Awards Best Podcast Host. So well done, Isabel.
Thank you.
Yeah, but I have on my notes here that you also enjoy playing with Lego, watching lots of bad TV and impromptu afternoons in the pub, of which I've been a participant on some occasions at least.
A collaborator. Yeah.
But yeah, thank you, Andy, for the introduction. And yeah, that saves us doing any more of this.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, well, maybe we should just say that we're going to show some slides. We'll go through a little bit about the work that introduced Andy to us and then why Andy asked us on. And then we're going to go through lots of different, or a selection of artists who speak to some of the themes that we're talking about today. And then sum up, rather than conclusions, maybe just some more questions, really. So I'm going to crack on and share my screen. And we can get going. Okay, so you should be able to see that, yeah? Yeah, okay, great. So I can actually skip past these first two and on to thoughts in the field. And what I'm going to do is post a link to a clip of our collaborative piece, Getting Lost. So I'll just quickly copy that link for everybody, and you can then load that up and listen to it. It's just a couple of minutes long, and then you can come back and join us. I'm just going to post it in here now, and then I will talk about the piece, and Tullis is going to talk about the paper as well.
While you're all loading that up, I'll just add that this is a 2 to 3 minute clip of a piece that Isobel and I created together, which is about 9 minutes in total. So this is from the first half of the piece.
Trying to get to the higher ground at the top of the field. Trying to see where the style might be. Certainly wasn't where I ended up. Oh.
On the ground there's lots of branches or roots coming up, and now there's lots of ferns as well.
Grass is really high, buttercups, but mainly thistles.
There's rocks jutting out of the grass everywhere.
Also just got this weird paranoia. I suddenly remembered that grass snakes exist in England. A few weeks ago I was on a walk in Brazil and a great big green snake came out in front of us. It scared the living daylights out of me. So now I can't stop thinking about the fact that that might happen in rural parts of the East Midlands.
Now I can see the two gables of the house to my left. And there's sheep grazing beside it. And there's rocks out in the middle of the sea, which I'd hope were there might be seals, but I can't see any, unfortunately.
I don't know where to go.
So I'm not sure whether I should go down or go left. I'm going to go back a bit.
So I'm going to climb over this dry stone wall.
I guess I should just go left here so I can get to the house on the left. Yeah, this looks like a path.
My legs are really stinging. Oh. Where the hell's this footpath?
This is all grassy, this path, and a bit boggy. Yeah. So it's all completely overgrown. The house, all that's left are the walls, and there's a chimney and loads of sheep.
So that was, like Tullis said, that was a section of a larger piece called Getting Lost, which is just under 9 minutes long. It takes clips from different recordings that were made. Tullis made his recording in Winksworth in Derbyshire, and then I made my recording on the Isle of Harris. And what we found when we were kind of listening to the recordings, and I'll talk a little bit about how this all came about, but when we were listening to recordings we've been sending each other, these two seem to have parallels in terms of us clearly getting lost while we were out looking for, places to field record or record in the field. But then what also seemed to come up in this was us both starting to think about what it means to be home. And for Tullis, it was about him being back where he grew up, but not feeling particularly like it was home anymore, and that he'd been in very urban environments. And then for me, it was that I was around a lot of derelict cottages on the Isle of Harris and thinking about what they meant in terms of that sense of home and that sense of decay and that sense of kind of losing that, but also clinging on to it as well. So there were those parallels. So we thought it'd be interesting to kind of splice them together and create this strange place in between those two recordings. And so the reason that we started doing this kind of work was because both of our PhDs had these interesting overlaps. And so Tullis's PhD, he can describe it much better than me, or as most PhD students would say, can't describe it at all. But basically, his was about composition and using ethnographic practices to use field recordings and to compose sound pieces as well. I know I'm botching this, maybe Tullis. And then my PhD was about how we construct senses of place and senses of self, and how sound can be used as some kind of medium or media to explore that placemaking and that self-making. So the crossovers were quite obvious in terms of the fact that we were field recording, we were looking at sites, we were looking at human experience, and we were trying to make sense of how that gets formed. So we started sending back and forth these really, really informal recordings to each other, where Tullis was kind of traveling around the world a lot. I was doing much less exotic traveling around the British Isles. So he'd be like traveling in places like Rio. and I'd be, yeah, in somewhere like a bog somewhere in Britain. And and I remember sending the first of these to Tullis, because what we'd been talking about was just all the inner decisions and experiences that you go through when you're field recording that rarely make it to that finished audio. Even if they're there in quite subtle ways, it can be quite difficult even to remember them as an artist. And we just were really interested about how, on the one hand, you could record these experiences of field recording and record the decisions that go into it, and how that really shapes the finished product of the audio, but that we could also then see how that would shape the way that the audio is received, and also then with our own practice, what it would be like to listen back and learn about what we were doing, and that process unfolding. And like I say, a lot of the time that can kind of get lost in your process. And while people have people have kind of done that in various ways through writing a lot, and even keeping voice notes, we thought it would be interesting to do it as actually part of the actual field recording. So that's what you're hearing, obviously, is us in the field, on our kind of trips out recording, but recording our voice as we're going, with a really clear intention to position ourselves as the recordists in the work, and to position the messy imperfection of all of that. Because I mean, like, whenever we listen to that back, we listened to it recently together, and I was laughing because Tullis just sounds so out of breath. And I mean, I sound almost like I've been sedated. So it's just very, very interesting, even like hearing our different personalities as we're going about what we're doing. And and the different terrains that we're on. Clearly, I was not going uphill and Tullis was. So just we were interested in that, basically. And so we started this kind of, it was almost like a kind of pen pal thing. And we ended up calling it Thoughts in the Field, because it's literally what it was. It was our thoughts recorded in real time in the field. And we also became interested in why, or if there might be a snobbiness about capturing the presence of the recordist, and not just in a very subtle way, but in a really overt way, like what you just heard. And why there can be a real hesitancy to make that kind of work overtly personal, in terms of actually hearing somebody's voice and their thoughts in the recording. And so that's really where the piece came about. And so we edited this together in the studio, and it became something more considered. But it started off as this very kind of back and forth, loose and free dialogue. And then we wrote a paper about it. So I'll let Tullis tell you about that.
Thanks, Isobel, and thanks for managing to succinctly describe very elegantly my PhD research topic far better than I ever could. So this creative practice that we were engaged in this kind of relatively informal way, but then becoming, I guess, more formalized as we made this piece out of this process, and this interest in sending back and forth these kind of thoughts in the field. As both of us had this background of creative practice as research within academia, we did write a paper which then was published a few years ago. And that was one of the reasons that Andy kindly invited us tonight. So we thought it might just be worth very briefly summarising that paper for those of you that haven't necessarily read it yet. And so really, I think in briefest terms, that paper tries to locate our sound practice within the kind of wider constellation of themes. So those are kind of around narrative and around self or auto documentation. And so the paper is quite a broad-based discussion in many ways, and draws on relatively broad disciplinary research, so it's quite multidisciplinary. And so it kind of has three stages, I guess. The first is that we attempt to define narrative, and we looked at the theme of narrative in scientific discourse, in philosophical discourse, and in artistic discourse as well. And then we kind of moved on to the narrative turn, and this sense that since the 1970s, the social sciences have had this understanding of the presence of the author, the researcher, the body of the practitioner within that field of research and practice, whether it's psychogeography or critical cartography, ethnography, anthropology. And so that led us to, I guess, two particular types of self-documentation in autotopography and also autoethnography. And so those two things kind of converge in this, in the methodological underpinning of this work. And then we move on to sound practice, and so how this relates to field recording, also to acousmatic music, to radiophonic work, to audiovisual practice and installation practice, and sound mapping. So we have a number of different examples in the paper, hardly any that we're going to present today. So today we're kind of, I guess, reflecting on that period of time back in 2014, 15, 16, when we were making this work and writing about it, and perhaps in hindsight or in that interim period between then and now, the kind of practice that we think also resonates with some of these ideas that we were writing about and discussing and creating at the time. And so that's really what we're going to do next. But the first of these 5 examples that we're going to play is actually one that we discussed in the paper. So we're going to look at 5 examples from anywhere between 1989 and 2021 from various parts of the UK, also Canada and Brazil. So we recognise that in this short period of time, in this sort of short selection, there's so much greater plurality than we're able to even touch on in the limits and the finite framework of this talk. But nevertheless, hopefully this gives a bit of a flavour of some other artists and other artworks that we think resonate with the kind of ideas and questions, I guess, that are provoked in the paper and in the piece as well. So I'll hand back to Isobel for the first of those.
Okay, so we're gonna start by just talking a little bit about Hildegard Westerkamp's Kit's Beach Sound Walk from 1989. So it's a relatively well-known piece of soundscape composition, field recording, and many people who are here tonight will probably be familiar with it. But if you're not, it's a piece which where you can hear Hildegard Westerkamp's voice first on top of a field recording of Kit's Beach in Vancouver, and then it kind of morphs into some slightly more surreal, slightly more abstracted, or really surreal and really abstracted sound worlds and ideas and narratives that Westerkamp is talking about, including dreams and dreams where she hears, particular high frequencies, things like that. So, but the bit that we're that I want to kind of flag up that is especially relative to what we're talking about tonight is about the way that Hildegard Westerkamp overtly flags just how much control she has as the recordist and also as the composer in how the listener will relate to that work, because she very overtly says, if and she actually comments on how beautiful the view is, and therefore she says the soundscape sounds like this, and she turns down the sound of the traffic using different effects, and particularly EQ. And she can kind of manipulate the sound of the traffic to sound less intrusive. But she kind of very, I think, skillfully shows just how subjective these recordings can be, depending on the decisions that we make. So that was a big inspiration personally for me. That was when I heard that piece, and then when I started really looking into this for my own work, it really made me question why are we not more upfront about this in a way, depending on the context and if it's appropriate. I just found that very interesting, and so that's a really fundamental piece that has been an important part of this discussion. And then Tullis, I believe you're going to talk about Jacqueline Waldock as well, and we have a clip for that as well.
Yeah, brilliant. So I guess coming a bit more from a slightly different angle in terms of the sonic practice, this work by Jacqueline Waldock is one that I think Isobel and I have both discussed together and have both found to be really resonates with some of the various aspects of our individual practice and also this collaborative work that we're talking about today. If you're not familiar with Jacqueline Waldock's work in Welsh Streets, which is an area of Liverpool, it's a kind of community engaged project with residents of these houses in Welsh Streets, which were under a compulsory purchase order. And so there is, if that's not a kind of familiar term, it's a sort of a forced eviction through probably through kind of forces which wish to otherwise gentrify that area. And what was interesting about Welsh Streets was that the residents were kind of pushing back quite vociferously with this, and so various residents were not accepting the various offers made by council and developers to buy their properties, but rather wished to stay there and retain the sense of community that they had. And so the participants, the resident participants in Jacqueline Waldock's work with them used sound recording to document this kind of socio-political change as a result of the compulsory purchase orders. And her method included leaving recording devices with the participants for repeated use in their own time. So it wasn't sort of limited to workshop time or sort of a framework. It was much more open to the participants leading their own, finding their own way with these recording devices. And so Waldock discusses how that method kind of accessed quite private and often unheard spaces, remembering that these participants are not, many of them were not well versed in sound arts practice or even sound artists or creative individuals they felt at all. Nevertheless, they were engaging in this creative activity on a kind of quotidian daily basis. And I think that it's sound practice as opposed to, for example, videoing or audiovisual practice, and is quite crucial to accessing this otherwise unheard and normally private space. And so we thought we might just share with you a 1.5-minute clip, which is titled Dinner with Barb 2. And this just gives a small example of the kind of sound recording, the sort of, a flavour of what Waldock is talking about when she says that you're able to access this sort of otherwise unheard or somewhat further private space. So we'll just give you 1 minute or 2 minutes to have a listen to that. So I hope that's given you time enough to take in that clip. And it is also dinner time at the moment, so hopefully that hasn't distracted you too much, their salad dressing, from thinking about the matters in hand here, which is the nuances of autoethnographic field recording. So the work here that Waldock's talking about, this process or this idea of a variety, a distributed variety of participants working together. Some of those collected sounds were composed into sort of more formal pieces by participants in parallel with Waldock. Some of those were later shared online or even on the local radio, but the fundamental underpinning for this project was the process itself, and I think that that's something that Isobel and I found quite interesting. Also, an emphasis on less than perfect, whatever that might mean, recording artifacts. Waldock has a couple of interesting reflections which I'll just share with us. Firstly, the difficulties of partnering with collaborative composition when the sounds that were perhaps significant to Waldot were deemed less significant by the participant, and sort of trying to find that resolution in that tension. And it sort of exemplifies a kind of redressing of the agency on behalf of the non-professional participant. And I think that's something that I've found particularly useful in some work that I've been doing. And also that these interventions were kind of politically motivated. And I think that's an interesting topic in terms of this wider discussion on participation. She talks about a kind of multifaceted or tripartite role of the academic, the activist, and the artist, and balancing those positions. So I will pass back to Isobel, who's going to share another work with us.
Yeah, so the next work that we're going to consider is Ruby Colley, Paul's Garden, and kind of in a similar sense to Welsh Street's Jacqueline Waldock, it's looking at a very domestic environment, but it's a domestic environment that is that Ruby, the composer, chose for specific reasons. So just to give you a little bit more context, this is part of 4 video pieces that Ruby made called Edgeland. And she says Edgeland is taken from the environmentalist Marion Shord, who coined the term, which she defined as the interfacial interzone between urban and rural. And the films focus on a particular place that I've long admired, the place where the sea meets the industrial estates of Bulverhithe in West St Leonards. So the piece kind of thinks about the climate catastrophe and these places where the urban and the rural meet, and how they can be quite strange zones, but then also, for example, in the book Edgelands by Paul Ferry and Michael Simmons Roberts, they say that they're often unnamed and ignored, but they're places where our slipstream has created a zone of inattention in which all manner of interest and beauty thrive. So Ruby has done this kind of study on this particular, what she has decided or is questioning is an edgeland. And one of these videos is taken in her brother's garden, Paul. And her brother is neurodiverse. And so you can hear Paul, and it's what would be called as his sort of supportive environment. So we'll talk a little bit about the sounds that you can hear, but she's intentionally documented it to document what that environment is for Paul. So I'm just going to put that into the chat.
Just while Isobel does that, I'll just respond to it. There's a few comments coming up about not being able to hear any sound. So the intention is, in order to be able to hear the sound in its best quality, that you should do that locally. So by clicking on the link and then accessing the audio, and we'll just have a pause in this session whilst you head off to another tab on your browser, listening, or in this case, watching the link. So I hope that's clear.
Yes, thank you, Tullis. So this is the link. Go and copy it or just click on it and you can watch it now, and then we'll come back. Okay, so hopefully everyone's had a chance to watch most of that, if not all of it. So there's various sounds in that recording or that film. It's a really beautiful film and a really beautiful document of that, not just her brother, but I think also that edgeland, you know, that kind of hinterland between the rural and the urban. And the song that you heard, Mild Man's a Dustman, is one of Paul's favourite songs, and Paul likes to listen to music a lot. And Paul also loves trains. And so, you know, Ruby kind of actually says on the site where these are hosted, she says, it's interesting that he has found a home in a place that many would find undesirable. The fact that you can hear the trains all the time, he loves that. And so Ruby wanted to record and actually document this very domestic space that is also this kind of hinterland, but also is particularly suited to Paul, that may not be suited to lots of other people. And I asked her about why she felt it was important to include him in the recording, because obviously that comes back to what we're talking about tonight, about intentionally including the body and the voice. And although in this case it's not of the actual field recordist, it's of the people in that space, and him being her brother as well. He's been a very, very big part of her life, clearly. And she says, so Paul's interaction with space is subtle. He is non-lingual, so his expression and communication are through sound. How his support workers' sensitive response to his cues is, sound and body language. How his support workers respond sensitively to his cues is important to include, as it helps us understand what Paul is communicating. And she says it gives us a window into different ways sensitive communication can be expressed through space and place as well. And I think that's really important, because one of the things that we're kind of working towards in this discussion is why including the body and the voice and the presence of the recordist, but maybe those around them as well, why that might lead to greater diversity, greater inclusion within field recording pieces, practices, sound studies, commentary on such things as well, and who is seen to be worth documenting, what is seen to be worth documenting, and how. So we felt like this was a really important piece to include, and it's actually from this year, so it's really recent as well. So I urge you to go and check out the other videos that Ruby has made for that as well. I'm just checking if there's anything I've missed from my notes there.
5 minutes, Tullis. And
oh, wow. OK. OK, well, in that case, I'm going to hand over to Tullis, who's going to tell us a bit about a couple more projects before we sum up.
Yeah, thanks, Isobel. I was really grateful that you introduced me to this work by Ruby as well, so thank you for that. I'll just briefly then, being as we're short on time, talk about the Curitiba sound map. This is quite an interesting sound map, I think, because sound maps have, if you're not involved in the sort of detailed discussion, have been often found to be problematic for the ways in which they represent space, or the sort of tacit understanding that they could be a collaborative tool and way of representing distributed authorship through sound. So they have their place, but I think also have some issues. And I think that this work by Lilian Nakodo, based in Curitiba, which is a southern Brazilian city, is really interesting for subverting some of those issues and working with them in quite a creative way. So this comes from a practice of what a couple of writers have written about this work, and I was grateful to read their paper, which is by Chavez and Araujo. They talk about her practice being unruly sound walking. And so she encourages participants to engage in sound walking in perhaps less common ways. So rather than staying silent, to be social, to encompass playfulness that happens in the everyday. They're less concerned about the sort of hi-fi or quality of any recorded outcome, and more about the experience of the participants as an expressive individual. So I won't say too much more, except that you can visit maposonoro.com.br if you want to visit that sound map further. And we'll post that in the chat later. The final piece that we just wanted to touch on, I think, is helpful here because it's a fairly recent collaborative piece working with a community engaged sound practice, again, and distributed authorship. These are things that I'm particularly interested in researching. So Isobel, if you could switch on just to the next slide. This is a piece by Kate Carr, and it's a kind of disruptive sort of compositional collaboration between Kate Carr, who is a professional sound artist, and non-professional young people participating in her workshop, which is based at Eclectic in southeast London. And the audio piece that results from this workshop, I think, is quite interesting because it has some carefully constructed sort of undulating pitched drones, evidently quite kind of professional work, and some less polished, almost distorted, shorter samples, often recorded by the younger people who are getting really excited by using the recording device to record their own voice, and they start to experiment in ways that aren't really to do with the sound environment, but more to do with the experience. And the outcome is sort of an interaction between these two positions, and there's an audible clarity between those two entities, but also a blurring of those positions is heard. And so probably the best way to experience this is just a minute-long excerpt which we've got. And so, if Isobel, if you're okay to drop that into the chat as well, please, I'd be very grateful. So that'll be the final thing that we'll do before we summarize. So this is just a 1 minute long audio clip of Kate Carr's work with these young participants. Hopefully that's given you a chance to hear that. I think that the only thing I'll add is that one of the subtle but I think really effective ways in which Kate Carr works with some of that material is by looping elements that perhaps would otherwise be considered to be sort of technical imperfections or distortions. By having them repeated immediately, they become normalized, or they become more sort of palatable, or there's an expectation that is then ruptured or changed. So I think that's a really, really interesting way to subvert some of those norms that are in otherwise expected in kind of hi-fi listening experience. So we're really keen to open this out to a discussion, as Andy said in his introduction, and I think that's really where we're heading now. The only thing we have is perhaps to preface this with some questions of our own, which might then act as sort of stimulants for the conversation that we'll hopefully have from here on. Isobel, did you want to kick off?
Yeah, so I guess one question we were thinking about was, although people definitely are field recording, lots of different people are field recording, a lot of the projects that kind of, you know, still are more high profile or get funding, or certainly are kind of featured or recognized by the Academy, are still, I guess, people being encouraged to pick up this medium and being encouraged to explore it, but through a project that has not been necessarily designed or thought up or by themselves. And so we were kind of thinking, at what point does it become almost like Instagram stories, or could it become something where people use it, or not even necessarily as fleeting as Instagram stories, but something that is a medium for them to express themselves, because I guess there clearly is a lot of room and potential for a lot of self-expression through this kind of narration and physical human sound, but also that and how that might become something very autotopographic in terms of how you identify the place, how that starts to form as something that feels real or hyper real, or an expression of yourself. So that was a question we had, you know, how does it become so diverse and inclusive that people are automatically doing this without, and people are doing it on a larger scale without, you know, to be blunt, a white academic coming along with a project in mind, let's say. So that was one thought.
Yeah, and I think that another thought we had was to do with the role of technology in all of this. So in some ways, technology is often tacitly described or understood to be these days relatively ubiquitous and affordable. And in some senses that's the case, but that is definitely not the whole picture. And I think meanwhile, when there is really exciting work happening, the kind of technological power structures, you know, algorithmically driven listening, the tastemakers, media writers, those sort of things, the way in which things rise to the top of the pile to be heard, listened to, found, discovered. How greater equality and a greater diversity can be reached within those sort of technologically driven systemic issues as well. So that was another thing that we ask ourselves and want to ask the wider community as well.
Yeah, and I guess the other thing that kind of came to mind was, if it does encourage us to think and talk and express relationships to places, what implications does that have for people understanding or, moving forward with the climate emergency as well? That obviously the World Soundscape project, for all its possible flaws, had this big driver to kind of highlight how the world was changing, and in many ways they would say for the worst in terms of noise pollution. So what does this mean? How could this medium of kind of overtly discussing our relationships with places via the medium of field recording, where does that take us with the climate emergency, or how does that contribute to that discussion?
Thank you for listening to us, and I hope that's been some input and food for thought, and thanks, Andy.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think, if it's okay, I would like to ask the first question. Just to let everyone know, I've switched everyone's cameras back on now, and so when you would like to switch your microphone on, you can do that as well. My question is, so I've got this book on my shelf. Oh, not this one. I'll come back to that one in a minute. Reflexivity in Film and Literature. It's a whole book on reflexivity. And I can't find the equivalent in something like Sound Studies. What I've got, however, is I've got one article by Helen Thorington in this collection of articles, radio text. And I'm absolutely delighted to say, by the way, that Helen's joined us this evening. So Helen's an absolute pioneer. Well, she is a pioneer of American radio art. And she's one of the few people, it seems to me, within the field of sound studies to have written about reflexivity. So I wonder, Tullis and Isobel, why is it we've got so much of this in film studies, and why have we got so little of it in sound studies?
Isobel, do you want to go first?
I think we're both dreading this question. It's a really good question, Andy, but it's obviously a difficult one to answer. Go
for it.
No, I was just going to say that I think that for a long time, when it comes to audio, there's been a real pride in things being very, very high quality, and also maybe quite complicated as well, to be honest, in certain spaces, not everywhere. And this idea that that there is a real expertise in making recordings, especially making recordings on location, and that therefore it's important to preserve that almost that mystique, but also that there's also a preference for something being very objective rather than being subjective. Definitely, and particularly in more kind of mainstream discussions, I guess, and practices. What are you going to say, Tullis? Save me.
Oh, you don't need saving. I have a couple of things to add, I guess. One is that I think that there's always a tendency, to my mind, in sound practices and music to be behind some other critical trends in fine arts or in the social sciences. So I think that for a lot of the narrative turn that we talked about in that paper, you see that appearing in ethnography and in anthropological practice from the 1970s onwards, but yet the sort of the equivalent in field recording is only relatively recently emergent. I think that that's probably where the reflexivity in sound lies, is within the kind of strand of sonic anthropology. And so there is that sort of inherent reflexivity within anthropological practice. And so when that is developed within sound and sound recording, that's where some of that lies. But how much that confluences with sound studies per se, I'm less sure. So yeah, that's what I would add.
I was just thinking another thing to add might be that I think that both in terms of academia and also in terms of media, I think sound has often been overlooked, or a lot of people have felt that it's been overlooked. And so I think that it's kind of, sometimes it's more of an afterthought, especially when it comes to things like the film industry, and particularly in audiences' minds. And I think that maybe therefore there's been this feeling that, well, we've got to show that what we're doing is really, really, difficult and complicated and really objective and really, really high quality all the time, rather than something that is maybe imperfect and requires some self-reflection and some vulnerability to really understand what's actually going on behind it, for example. And I know that Ian Finley Walsh, who's here, Ian just put being heard is very exposing, which I think is a really good point. It is exposing. It does make you feel vulnerable. And I think then when you step away from those hard and fast facts of right and wrong, it becomes complicated, like really complicated, about what something's value is and what it means. And so if you're already struggling to prove that your medium and your field is important, maybe that's why it's been less likely to be kind of talked about in this way.
Okay, thank you very much. So we've got a couple of hands raised. So actually the first one's from Helen Thorington. Helen, do you have a question? Or a comment rather? Or something to share?
While we're waiting for Helen, would you mind if you, I think you could probably stop sharing the screen and
Oh yeah, sorry.
I think we can maybe see people a bit better.
Yes.
Thank you.
Let me see if it's to do with me. Maybe I've over muted. Let me just check the settings. Let's have a look. No, everyone's got control of their. Let's have a look. Yeah, I think everyone should have control now of their microphone and camera. So let's go back to the hands raised. Let's have a look. So maybe we'll go to Beth then. Beth, you've got your hand raised.
Yeah. Hi. So really regarding your questions, Isobel and Tullis, this has come at the perfect time for me, because I'm literally studying a master's and I'm embarking on a project with field recording, and for me it's quite uncomfortable. And actually what happened today was I was given permission, and I really felt like that was like an answer for some of these questions that you've got, like being given permission to actually just go and experiment. And I was lucky enough to find a Zoom HM4 for 20 quid on sale on Facebook ads, which is pretty amazing. But before that, I was just using my mic, my mobile phone. And that's just so much easier and so accessible. Everyone has them. And I think just being given that permission to just go and experiment, whether you're someone who knows anything about sound or recording or not, I think that is where it starts. And I just don't think people realize that this is an option. This is something you can do. Like, even just watching this, for me, it's kind of opened another door where I'm like, oh, I can just walk around and do my film and narrate it. I don't have to do this perfect studio edit afterwards, which is just so delightful for me, because it just makes the whole process feel so much freer. So I think, I feel like it's permission and normalizing the whole thing will really help. So thanks.
Thank you, Beth. I think that's I think that's really, I guess, you've kind of put it better than we could, in that it is about feeling that you have permission, even if you don't come from that background. And most people that come from particularly, well, certain parts of that background are going to look a certain way, have certain experiences. And I guess this is why me and Tullis are kind of feeling like the work that we're seeing, and hopefully some of the work that we've profiled tonight, is inviting different voices into what we're hearing, hopefully in some way. And go forth with your Zoom for 20 quid. That's wonderful, and I'm really glad you feel like it's okay for you to use it, because it certainly is.
Okay, thanks very much. Helen, let's just see. Helen, I wonder if your hand's raised to make a contribution or to ask a question. Okay, maybe not. Maybe it's what they call a legacy hand. Let's go to Ian Findlay-Walsh. So over to you, Ian.
Hiya. Can you hear me all right? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks for that presentation. I really enjoyed it. And yeah, most of that stuff I'd never heard before. So yeah, great to just be exposed to all that. I suppose I just wanted to kind of respond to one of the questions. I think it was you, Isobel, said something like, why might including the body and the voice and the presence of the recordist lead to greater diversity in these kind of practices? And I don't know, just talking about, I was interested in a comment that one of you made really early on, that in Getting Lost, you wondered about whether it sounded snobby, or there was a snobbishness to the kind of mode of expression or something like that. And I wonder if there's something in that, like maybe it's a kind of trope or cliche that like nobody likes hearing their own voice in a recording, because it's really exposing, and you kind of realize what you actually sound like. And if you're carrying the mic, then you realize what you actually not only speak like but move like. There's a kind of like extreme proximity to the way that you're being traced and the way that your kind of like agency can be heard and judged, right? And so maybe like staying with that question of like, do I sound like, do I like the way I sound here, and like trying to kind of pick apart or like problematize the sound of like one's own agency. Kind of going back to that question, it's like, if you can hear the recordist in the field, then maybe there's a discomfort there that they have to confront, which is a kind of leveler that kind of like connects them to the others who are kind of traced in the field as well. I don't know if there's something there, but I find being recorded in the field uncomfortable, and yeah, perhaps there's a kind of like potential there in that discomfort to diversify in some way.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Well, I mean, essentially, I'd entirely agree. That's a really articulate way of posing that as a kind of open-ended invitation. But I think to me, it just speaks to the common ethical dilemma that many field recordists have, which is, whilst perhaps trying to make themselves as invisible as possible within the recorded space, quite often coming across snatches of conversation or other human or the non-human sounding elements within a sound space, a sound environment, and then having a kind of power and an authorship over those other entities, which is quite a dynamic. It's quite a strong dynamic, to be in charge of that. And so I think the kind of thing that you're articulating there is sort of the first thing that we should really be confronting, which is ourselves and our own bodies and our own voice and our own movements and our own presence. And if you are editing that out, but allowing yourself authorship over those other sounding entities who haven't necessarily participated actively in your recording, but nevertheless are being presented in it, that's pretty problematic. So essentially I'm agreeing with you, but saying that I think it's really important as an ethical consideration is to think about your own agency and action before any others.
Yeah,
Can
and
you
I guess
hear me now?
Yes.
You can?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. My apologies. I didn't see the mute on mute. Anyway, don't let me interrupt this particular part of the conversation. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I was just going to add in response to Ian that I think it's a really, really good point that it is uncomfortable hearing yourself a lot of the time. But that also I think then that's really contextual, isn't it? Because one person might feel that, but another person might immediately feel, oh yeah, I feel really, really brilliant that I was able to say what I wanted to say about that place and I've made it my own. And, there could be loads of reasons why you might listen back and actually feel really revved up and really excited to share it with somebody. And also there could be lots of things ways that you could prepare that process so that you're aware that you're probably going to cringe, or that you can go into that recording process with an intention of why you're doing that, which would then change the way that you listen back to it as well, and how you would feel about sharing it with other people too.
Okay, thank you very much. Helen, I think you've been waiting a while. Over to you now.
Well, I was just going to say that I'm not a practicing artist anymore. I gave it up 5 or 6 years ago and retired the organization and the commissioning of artists, which is too bad, but that's the direction it was going in. My own work has been something else, quite different from what I'm hearing from you. Largely just moving toward telling stories in sound without using the human voice. And this is something that I got quite involved in for a period of time before I stopped. And I'm very happy to see the interest in sound coming now from you. I wish I were younger. I'm in my 90s, so I'm not likely to go back.
I think, Helen, if I can just interject a second, I think what struck me about the piece that you wrote back in 1988, and that was then republished in radio text, was the way in which you talk about the technology itself and how your interaction with the technology creates particular kind of sounds that then become part of the work, in the way that, often it's those sounds of, I think you make reference to quarter-inch tape, fast forwarding, reversing, the clicking of the machine, all the sounds that are normally forbidden in recording become part of your work. So I thought it's slightly different from self-reflexivity, but it's got that kind of interest in reflexivity, in the sense that we're drawn to pay attention to the construction of the work itself. And I think your wonderful phrase was, it's the sound of me doing work, which you can hear in some of your art. So I just wanted to mention that for people who might not be familiar with your work.
Well, thank you for mentioning it. I frankly had forgotten about it. But after that came my what had became a longer interest, and perhaps even a greater one, of how to tell a story without using the human voice. And this continues to interest me. I did one piece, for instance, where I take you through a cave and introduce you to the living creatures in that cave, and bring you out the other side. And that was of great interest to me, because there's no voice at all directly or telling you what's happening. But people got it, and were interested. You know, all I can really say is keep on doing it, because I think sound is one of the most interesting parts of the whole business.
Thank you very much. I think let's go now to, I think, Marcus, you were next.
I think Beth was before me, so I would let Beth go first.
Okay, over to you, Beth.
I think maybe this is from when Beth had asked a question before. Is that right? Yeah. So can you take your hand down, Beth? Thank you.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Can you hear me? Sorry,
Yes.
It's really dark in here. This was really inspiring. I'm actually just starting my practice-based PhD, and I'm combining sound studies, a digital sound map, and psychogeography to kind of develop my own practice, but also involve participants. So I'm kind of trying to think about, it's about Manchester and kind of expressing your relationship to place through sound, and everybody can devise their own sound map. So it's kind of like diversifying it, but at the same time, I didn't think about the actual voice of participants being in recordings. Like I wouldn't set any boundaries of like, oh, it has to be like field recordings that you integrate that need to be, I don't know, traffic or like anything city specific. I wouldn't kind of set any boundaries, but I never thought about a voice. But I kind of feel it kind of really inspired me, because it kind of got me thinking about what a field recording can be, because often we just think about a field recording being, let's say, a recording of a car or recording of traffic or recording of construction sites or whatever. But thinking about it, maybe including voices, it could even be, I think it could be something so flexible. But what I want to say is basically, sorry, I could just keep rambling on, but basically, a voice could also be maybe reflecting on the field recording afterwards, maybe in terms of writing, maybe kind of having some sort of like reflective focus group or some reflective journal to kind of reflect on it afterwards. So maybe even if you have like field recordings that don't contain any voice, I can imagine maybe thinking about what that sound meant to you or what a field recording meant to you afterwards could still have a really subjective quality. So it just got me thinking about different ways how you can think about subjectivity in field recordings and where the voice is located in all of that. So it's not really a question, it's more just like, it really got me thinking also about sound maps, the problematic situation about ownership and what did you say, how space is represented. That's really important. So thank you very much for bringing those things up.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that, because I think that's a really interesting idea about when that reflection and that self-reflexivity happens. And I guess what I would kind of offer back for that point is that it probably changes how and what you reveal, because when you're recording yourself on a field recording, maybe you're performing in a certain way. In fact, you definitely are. You know, you're going to be saying certain things in certain ways because you are aware that it may be listened to by somebody else, and that is a recording that will be kept and repeatable. Whereas if you're in a group discussing a field recording afterwards, perhaps you talk about it in a different way, and perhaps you reveal different things, and perhaps you forget things, and perhaps you remember things, and perhaps you have new insights that you wouldn't have had in the field as well. And so I think they're similar, but they're different. And I think it would be interesting to see what comes up by, you know, discussion and reflection in different contexts. And also, I think it'd be interesting to do recordings of people discussing before they go out, you know, and discussing what they're going to do and why they've decided to do it. It's another point where we could have these discussions too.
Thanks very much. I think. Oh,
sorry,
sorry,
Andy.
over to you.
Yeah, if we have a moment, I just wanted to respond as well. Yeah, I think both to Marcus and also to Helen before. Firstly, I just think it's wonderful to have you here, Helen. Thank you so much for joining us, and it's great to hear you. And you brought up something that I think is important just to highlight here, that Isobel and I picked some of these examples today to try and find a kind of link between them. And so that link was the voice, but it's not to say that we think that this self-reflexive narrative position or ways in which sound practice can can recognize the presence of the recordist isn't necessarily solely to be through the voice at all. And so that's, I think, really helpful to bring that up and important to say. And so it sort of talks a little bit to Marcus's point as well. And I was just going to add, Marcus, that it sounds a bit to me like you're talking about dialogic editing practices. And so that makes me think, of course, of the work that Steve Feld does. But I've been exploring that with larger groups of non-professional participants where people make various different recordings and then sit in a room together and listen to each other's and talk about them and try and co-compose in that way. And that's had some really interesting results, and recording those conversations and weaving those into the work can be really fruitful, I think, and allow a sense of the shared authorship to be heard. You know, what's wonderful about sound is that the human brain can process multiple streams at once, and so that allows us to explore that idea of multiple authorship, I think. Yeah, so if you're interested, the Walls on Walls project that was mentioned earlier was something that has that as a part of the practice, as well as many other projects that I'm not involved in, of course.
Okay, thanks very much. I think Joseph.
Hi there. Hi.
Hi.
This is fascinating and such an interesting idea in terms of all the reflexivity. And it kind of got me thinking a little bit about convention and tradition and how we kind of view recordists or sound recordists or field recordists, and that idea that I kind of come from a film background, so film recordists, you're quiet on set because otherwise you interrupt what you're trying to record, which is the performer. Or in music, you're recording the musician and the recordist is the quiet person. And then I think producing kind of begins to play with that boundary by the sounds that we hear of the producer doing their work, and it all moving around that. And then thinking about the idea of the performer, the musician, or even the artist, and those kind of traditions of self-portraiture and visual art and things like that. And it all kind of got me thinking, well, coming to my question, which is, how do you view yourselves in terms of field recordists? What is a field recordist, and is there something almost alienating about that, perhaps, if in terms of the term field recordist? Hope that makes sense.
Do you want to go first, Tullis? Tullis is frozen.
I don't necessarily want to go first, but I can.
Okay.
Yeah, I can.
I can go first.
Go for it.
Okay. I think that, well, I guess just your question, I think you raised some really good points. Obviously, in sound, we're kind of encouraged and required to be really quiet a lot of the time. And so then that sets up an expectation, I guess, even unverbalized, that we will be quiet, because otherwise we're going to wreck the production or whatever it is. But when it comes to, I guess, you know, coming to the point that I'm at now, where of going through a lot of time making work that's in some way similar to what we've been talking about today, but not exactly all the time. I guess for me, I have different, it's a spectrum, let's say. there's some projects and there's some recordings where I am deadly quiet because I need it to be a certain way. I want it to be a certain way. And then there's other projects like Getting Lost where I'm intentionally just being very free about it and not trying to get this pristine recording. And then there's all these other things that kind of lie in the middle of that. And then projects that mix different approaches together. So for me, that's where I see it. And I think that it's still, I think that I still feel like not making everything perfect is vulnerable, and it still feels scary, and it still feels like not everyone's going to get that or respect that. But I also think there's something really interesting and creative about allowing yourself to play and allowing yourself to foreground mistakes, and kind of like what Tullis was saying with Kate Carr, that you might even then emphasize those things that would normally be seen as big no-nos, like clipping the audio. Well, what happens if you exaggerate that? What happens if you start to embrace this stuff? And I think that's really exciting creatively, personally. And I think just I'm the kind of person that I get turned off as soon as someone tells me it has to be done this way and that's it. So I think knowing I have a whole different bunch of identities when it comes to the kind of field recordist I could be is very creative, and that's how I see it, basically.
Yeah, thanks, Joseph. I think it's a really great way to frame the question, thinking visually about, the idea of the boom operator being somebody who is inherently out of sight, out of earshot. There's that classic gag, isn't it, that where the mic drops into shot, and so that's an error, or it's funny or whatever, those kind of things. In terms of the field and field recording, the term, I think that there is a similar sort of understanding that the recordist will sort of place some microphones and then coil some cable as far back as they can and get out of shot and allow the scene to emerge, the non-human sounding entities to sort of sound as they were before that interruption happened where the microphone was placed or something like that. And all of those things, if a recording is presented in that way, there's so much framing before that has been pressed, before record has been pressed, that I think recognizing that, you made me think about those, the idea of the silence in music recordings, or recordings of let's say classical music. But then my favorite recordings of Bach piano works are Glenn Gould, where you can hear him singing along and breathing heavily and sort of talking to himself and all that sort of stuff. And I think that that's maybe my just my taste, but I that's probably where I start to get interested in a recording, is when there's something that adds a bit of depth. So some examples are, I think the field for me is a space where there might be multiple sounding entities, and you invite the listener to try and work out the connections. So I did some work a few years ago where I sat in the living rooms of jazz musicians and listened to records with them and recorded our conversations whilst the music was playing in the background, and that became sort of source material for compositions. More recently, I've been working with chamber musicians, and I sat in on 2 weeks worth of rehearsals, and I recorded every second, and I bleed those rehearsals into the final performance in inverted commas. So yeah, I'm quite interested by blurring that frame of the sort of polished performance. I think I'm rambling a bit now, so I'll probably stop. No. But thank you for the question and the comments, because I think it's really helpful to think about that norm and that expectation, and like Isobel said, almost immediately saying that's not how I want to do it then, because that's how you're told, and that there's something really interesting in immediately pushing against that, I think.
Thank you very much.
That's,
sorry, Joseph, do you want to say something before I wrap the
sorry,
session up?
I'm going to say, I think that's really interesting, and it now makes me think about where we find lots of writing about reflexivity is in documentary, and if we reframe our thinking of it in that regard, then it all becomes, yeah, makes lots of sense. It's fascinating and some wonderful recordings. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we're coming towards the end of the session now, and first of all, I'd like to thank Isobel and Tullis for their presentation tonight. And could I ask everyone just to turn on your microphone for a few seconds and just give them a round of applause? And I'll start it off.